We look into the role of women in resistance movements and alternative forms of living. It also falls into several research strands that the public program and research team have been developing. We are very pleased to have with us tonight such an amazing group of women who will discuss possible modes for a feminist curatorial practice today. Please welcome Anne Ellegood, Senior Curator at the Whammer Museum in Los Angeles, Laurence Rassel, Director of the École de Recherche Graphique, École Supérieure des Arts in Brussels, Helena Reckitt, Reader at Goldmisths University, and Lara Perry, who is a lecturer at the University of Brighton. Lara will share a conversation after Anne, Helena, and Laurence will do their presentations. I would also like to thank our collaborators for this event, the Feminist Curators United Network. And before we start, if you could all please put your mobile phones in silence. Thank you. I would like to give the space for Anne.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank everyone here at Nottingham Contemporary for hosting us today. We had a very interesting, lively, and intense at certain moments conversation all day. So we're kind of continuing on in the previous conversation of the day. And I'm just really happy to be here. So thanks for having me. So please raise your hand if you've been to the Whammer Museum in Los Angeles. Okay, that's about what I thought. And please raise your hand if you've heard of the Whammer Museum in Los Angeles. Okay, well, good. Maybe half the room. So I'm going to give the just 2-minute history of the museum and not spend a lot of time on that. But the Whammer Museum was founded in 1990 by Armand Whammer as really a boutique museum for his collection. Armand Whammer was the chairman of Occidental Petroleum, and he had put together a collection of mostly old masters' works. And he was building a building in LA, in Westwood, south of the UCLA campus, which is on the west side of Los Angeles, for his collection, to kind of show off his collection. And also it was an office tower for his company. So it was a kind of funny hybrid building that includes an office tower still, and then a 3-story museum with a courtyard and galleries for his collection. 3 weeks after the museum opened, Armand Whammer died. And so it was very uncertain at that moment what would happen to the museum. His family really had no interest in running a museum. The company wasn't particularly in support of him collecting in the first place. They didn't really care for the collection either. So here was this museum that existed and really no one with the passion behind it to run it. So it kind of stumbled along for a few years. And then in 1992, UCLA came forward and said, well, look, we're just north of you on campus. Of course, we are a campus. And we have our own collections. And why don't we join forces so that UCLA would become the umbrella organization for the Whammer Museum and the Whammer Collection. And then one major collection, which is called the Grunwald Collection of graphic arts, which is all works on paper, editioned pieces from the Renaissance to the present. That collection is over 50,000 objects at this point, which is a UCLA collection. That collection was brought to the Whammer. And then there's also a sculpture garden on campus that is a kind of 4th collection. And in the past decade, we've been building a contemporary collection, so there's 4 altogether. In 1994, that deal was made, and the Whammer became part of UCLA as the kind of umbrella organization under which we operate. So I'm technically a UCLA employee, but we do function as a fairly autonomous museum in the sense that we don't have obligations to the students or faculty on campus to show their work. We're not a university gallery in that more traditional sense. So in 1999, the current director, Anne Philbin, was hired, and she is responsible for turning the Hammer Museum into a mostly contemporary museum space that it's known today. So we do still have the Hammer's collection itself, and the Grunwald Collection, of course. We show those often, but we've also been building a contemporary collection and doing mostly contemporary programming with the occasional historic show. So, what I want to talk about today is an initiative that we started in the fall of 2016 called Bureau of Feminism, in keeping with our topic tonight. And I want to first read the Hammer's mission statement, because it's something that we rewrote relatively recently, only a couple of years ago. And it took a long time to actually write this, and it was a lot of conversations among the staff and the board. And I'm actually really, really happy with it. And it's very succinct, but also, I think, very forward-thinking. And the mission is: the Hammer Museum at UCLA believes in the promise of art and ideas to illuminate our lives and build a more just world. And what's so important about the mission is that we decided to put in a component about social justice. And that was something that we've always really believed in as an institution. We consider being part of the university means that we can take up any discipline we want and talk about and present any idea that might fall under the umbrella of the university. And we've always been a very progressive institution, but we never really fully owned it in that sense of putting it in our mission. So now I feel that the mission is really something we can use as a guide to our thinking in everything that we do. The other thing I should mention is that in addition to a relatively robust exhibition program, we have an incredibly active public program. We do over 300 public programs a year that include artist talks, film screenings, panel discussions, and the subjects are not just art. We deal with a lot of political content, current issues, theory, poetry readings, literature. So it's very cross-disciplinary, as I mentioned. And also in 2010, I believe it was, we started an arm or a part of our curatorial department called public engagement. And through public engagement, we do a lot of public programming type activities that are time-based, but often incorporate some kind of engagement or interactivity with the public, which I won't talk about tonight. So, Bureau of Feminism really grew out of conversations that our chief curator, Connie Butler, and I were having a couple of years ago, and we put together a kind of 2-day discussion with a group of our peers that we felt had a feminist practice, to talk about what it would mean for the museum to take on some kind of program rooted and committed to feminist practices. And we knew that we didn't want it to be an exhibition per se. We wanted to think about alternative models. And I mentioned earlier today that part of the conversation was the fact that Connie Butler had done this very important historical show a decade ago called WAC, Art and the Feminist Revolution. And coming up to the 10-year anniversary of that show, the question was being asked within our curatorial department, do we do a kind of second version of that show and look at contemporary practices, feminist practices within art? And we realized that we really didn't want to do that. We didn't want it to be some sprawling exhibition about feminism. What we wanted to do was find a way for the institution to commit itself to feminist practices, feminist questions, feminist programming over going forward, and through a kind of multi-platform approach. So I'm just going to leave this up for a minute. I'm sorry it's so long. But this will give you a sense of what, in fact, the Bureau of Feminism is. Okay, I'm going to start talking again. So the other real inspiration for wanting to think through this question of how we could make feminist practices more visible within our institution was a frustration around the way that feminist practices in art were being characterized in some sense and promoted within mainstream contemporary art practice. And so we talked about this earlier too, but our biggest concern was that there were a lot of shows being developed presenting the work of women artists, and that was being presented as if that necessarily meant it was feminist. And also it seemed to check a box in some sense, that if an institution or a gallery or whatever institution it is, were to present a show of all women artists, all women painters, all women sculptors, whatever the particular topic may be, that it was de facto considered to be feminist, and that it also seemed to be the way that, without a lot of creativity, the idea of feminism was put forward. Simply the increased visibility of women artists. Which, of course, I'm totally committed to that, and my institution, in fact, is also, and we make a very concerted effort to show at least 50% women artists. But we were recognizing that that is simply not enough. Whether the woman that you're presenting is feminist or not is, of course, different in each case, or whether they consider their work to be feminist. But we wanted to think about how do you move beyond these kind of quantitative mechanisms for understanding what we're doing as institutions and enter into a more discursive space, and also maybe a less predictable space, and that shows what I think is really the goal, which is not to just showcase, present, support, illuminate feminist practices, but to, in fact, become an institution that is feminist. So that is what I see as the goal. And when I say feminist, I also want to highlight that I mean also that issues of diversity across all different groups and categories are under the umbrella of feminism, and that it's a truly intersectional approach to how we think about feminism. So of course feminism doesn't mean just issues that apply to women. It's more of an ethos and an ideology around a just world and social justice. So I'm just going to run through what we've done in the last, I guess, year and a half it is, almost 2 years within the Bureau of Feminism. So it can take many, many forms, and you'll see that each of these slides I've started by just saying, what kind of format the program fell under. We launched it with a panel discussion with Roxane Gay and Andy Ensler, moderated by Connie. And this was a desire to unpack a little bit what we mean by the word feminism in current practices, but also to bring in maybe a more general audience in some sense, so take it out of the art world into a more popular culture kind of space. And I will say that, we didn't know what to think, but it turns out that Roxane Gay is completely a star. So we were completely sold out. There were all these people. They hung around afterwards, and there were students going up to Roxane and practically in tears. They were so excited to meet her. It was really interesting because I felt that it was this moment of, oh, okay, so feminism is kind of mainstream now, but what does that mean, or what do people mean when they say it? And obviously, if you know Roxane's book, it's all about this idea of being a bad feminist, which doesn't mean she doesn't embrace being a feminist. It means that she's questioning what the definition of it is today for her, and also as an African-American woman, this kind of tension between feminist practices historically and issues around social justice related to race, and her concerns about the history of certain feminist practices. So it was an interesting night. There were a lot of young women there, which I was struck by, who not only attended but really had questions and wanted to engage and seemed to be embracing the category of feminism. I won't talk about every program for this long, but it was an interesting moment to kick it off. There were performances such as this one by Jennifer Moon and Lob, and also Dynasty Handbag, who, if you've never seen, I highly recommend. She's wild. I'll try to pause long enough that you guys can at least read a little bit. We have artists in residence, such as Jeannine Olsen, who later had an exhibition, but before the exhibition did a performance around the research she was doing during her residency. We did a procession. I would say there were at least 100 to 150 people who participated with Lara Schnitger through Westwood up to campus and back, holding these artworks that she made that are like banners. It was really fun. Film screenings such as Cheryl Dunier's iconic The Watermelon Woman, which had been remastered on its 20th anniversary, and really thinking about the history of certain queer practices, and wanting to bring someone like Cheryl back to the museum to have a conversation and think about 20 years later what she believes to be the impact of that film, but also importantly, I think, what she's working on now. We had a dinner with a really interesting group in Los Angeles called Women's Center for Creative Work. So one of the impulses behind the Bureau of Feminism is to collaborate and acknowledge some of the smaller institutions around town that we think are doing important work. Okay. Another performance. In this case, we did an exhibition with Simone Lee, but then also during the run of the show did a performance between her and Rizvani Bradley. And this was following a really interesting project that Simone did at the New Museum that was all about the history of women and medicine and more kind of community-based holistic practices among women for healthcare. And so during that project, she brought in a lot of different healers of different kinds and held a lot of workshops at the museum, in many cases that were available only to African American women. And so some of what she was thinking about in that show got extended into this exhibition and performance. A series of film screenings of documentaries made by women dealing with a number of different topics. Through our public engagement program, we did a residency with Jen Kennedy and Liz Linden. And one of the projects is something they call the New York Times Reading Group, where you bring together a group of people and you read through the New York Times together and look for various biases that are expressed through the so-called objective language of journalism. And kind of culminated in this new performance called Telethon, in which they sort of reached out to the public through phone calls to simply ask the question, what is feminism? And the various answers would get projected onto the walls, and it became this kind of crazy space of course, many different ideas about what feminism in fact means. We did a lobby wall project with Andrea Bowers, who is very much an activist as much as she is an artist, and she had gotten really involved in the Dakota Access Pipeline protests and wanted to bring other organizations into her project to talk about water rights and also the role of large banks in the in land use issues. So the grid that you see on the left is all the banks that had actually contributed toward trying to get the Dakota Access Pipeline built. And then we did a series of discussions, performances with a group up at UCLA called African American Policy Forum, including this performance, Say Her Name. And this whole series was really very much about in connection to Black Lives Matter and thinking about the lives of young African American women, but also, as you'll see, also adults. I'm sorry I'm not giving you enough time to read these, but we've got to move along. And then this one was about Black women in Hollywood. So this was Jeannine's project, her Hammer project that grew out of her residency. And we had a really great conversation between Kimberl Crenshaw, who teaches up at UCLA and is an attorney and civil rights attorney. And she, in fact, coined the term intersectionality. So she's had a big part in thinking about civil rights going forward and how these different components of oppression in culture and in society need to be looked at simultaneously if we're to solve some of these problems. And then also Eve Ensler, the playwright, famously of the Vagina Monologues. So the two of them did this really funny talk in which they talked about the kind of impact on our psyches of the election of Donald Trump and how to sort of surpass all of the anxiety that we're feeling and move forward. More film screenings. And this is coming up next week. Unfortunately, I'll miss it, but stand-up comedy, which I think needs to be embraced in this political moment we're in. Thinking a lot about how humor, satire, caricature are these important historical strategies through which we think through really complicated issues. So I'll just close by saying that the Bureau of Feminism has no end date, importantly, and the goal of it is to rethink it constantly, what it is, what it could be, what have we done through the program, what could we do and haven't done, reaching out to a whole range of communities and voices and ideas to try to incorporate them into the Bureau, and ultimately to make sure that our commitment as an institution to feminist practices can be highlighted through that program, but also become more and more integrated so that perhaps someday there's no need to name it. It just simply is.
Hi, everybody. Yes, really like to thank our hosts today. We've had a really very kind of generous and thoughtful exchange amongst a group of people, most of whom comprise the audience. But thanks for the other people who came along. But it's been really interesting to think about how a kind of feminist consciousness might actually improve these arts institutions, both for the publics that engage with them, but also for the people who work in them. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit based on my experience working at arts organisations, not dissimilar to Nottingham Contemporary, some much more modest and sort of grassroots, and some a bit bigger, in London, Atlanta, Georgia, and Toronto, Ontario. None of them had permanent collections, so a bit like Nottingham Contemporary, there's a big emphasis on kind of production, and sort of we were all extremely busy all the time and a bit stressed out. But then in the last few years, I've been involved in teaching on a master's program in curating, so I've also become very concerned with people who are sort of entering into this curatorial field, and perhaps sort of managing some of their expectations about what can be quite a sort of precarious environment to work within, and in which there are a lot of, I suppose, sort of projections about what kind of life you might be leading and how fabulous it will be to be working with artists. And as a student said in an interview last year, oh yes, I see myself jumping on and off aeroplanes and going to art biennials. And I was thinking, well, A, you're not getting a place on this course, and B, you really need to lose some of those fantasies. So I'm interested in there's been quite a lot of talk amongst curators and some of the writing around curating, around the idea of curating and caring. And there's been a lot of reference to the etymological root of the word curating in the Latin for care. And I think this partly coincides with what we've seen as a sort of shift in the definition of curatorial labour, which has really come into place since the sort of 60s, when we had this phenomenon of the independent curator. So before that, most curators, were associated with managing and researching collections. And then from the 60s, we kind of came up with this new figure who was this sort of maverick, creative, almost sort of entrepreneurial figure. And for those of you who know about curating, Harold Zeman is sort of always rolled out as the kind of exemplary figure. And this curator became more of a sort of author than simply someone who was kind of caring for and looking after an art collection behind the scenes. They become much more high profile. And in this kind of shift from sort of behind the scenes, quite sort of quiet, studious work, the curator has now become one who manages and produces social networks, collective energies, and professional relationships. Now, of course, some of that energy goes towards artists and publics, but in the kind of funding climate we're in right now, where there's been really dramatic decrease in the amount of public money that goes to the arts, a lot of this caring energy, I observe, has gone towards the cultivation of wealthy patrons who might actually shore up the future of an arts organisation, or write a cheque to enable a curator to put on an exhibition or add a work to the collection. So it struck me that actually curators in their kind of feminized roles of mediation and caring are actually putting a hell of a lot of that energy towards the private sector and towards this cultivation of relationships in a way that's, I would say, even kind of eroding our conception of a public institution and our conception of the public realm. So we see patrons and collectors, private patrons and collectors, assuming a very high influence within arts organisations, within supposedly public arts organisations, but sort of they're quietly becoming increasingly privatised, as we have collectors sitting on the boards, sitting on acquisitions committees, being part of programming committees and so on. And there, of course, they can have a lot of influence over what gets shown and collected and promoted. They can also gain a lot of behind-the-scenes knowledge about these activities. And as the Guerrilla Girl, the feminist anonymous group, as the guerrilla girl known as Frida Kahlo has remarked, in any other industry, collectors would go to jail for this kind of insider trading. So what I started to feel very concerned about was that a lot of this caring labour was being directed towards the private sector. Some of it was indeed still going to artists, but perhaps the artists that it was going to was also reflecting a kind of collector mentality. So I was noticing that in order, and this was from my own experience, in order to persuade collectors to write cheques for me, it would really help if the artists I was showing were collected by those individuals, or to ask a bank to support a project if work by that artist was in the bank's corporate collection. Even if it wasn't as literal as that, it was a nice story to sell a collector. Oh, I'm going to be bringing in, this sort of famous artist, and there'll be dinners, and there'll be kind of chances to mix and mingle. And I felt I was finding that it was in many ways easier to raise money for a kind of big name artist show, monograph, than it was for, say, a group exhibition where it was much more about the ideas and perhaps a certain sort of criticality than it was to say, here we have it, here's the artist. But meanwhile, while that was where a lot of the energy was going, I started to feel that very little energy was going into caring for the behind the scenes, for the people who were involved in this cultural production. In fact, there was a real neglect of the collective efforts that sustained cultural work, particularly in the art field. So that has sort of led me to really question what's going on, and to start to think that it's perhaps an over-identification with the kind of public face of what we do as curators, with the desire to put on a show that will get good notices in the press, that will attract large audiences, that will get funded, and that has kind of been at the neglect of the colleagues who actually work behind the scenes. It's resulted in a lot of instability in the workplace with short-term contracts, lots of curatorial work being carried out part-time, a dependence on unpaid labour as well. And this, I think, is partly because, as I say, of a sort of over-identification with these roles. Now, and perhaps a sort of feminized desire to make everything work without showing some of the real difficulties that are at play. One of the contributors to the discussion we had earlier, who's recently become a curator in a new institution, said, I've always been very flexible in my work, but I'm actually trying to not be too adaptable. I want to sort of draw a line about what I think is and isn't working. And I think this feminized idea of being sort of bending over backwards to make everything go smoothly, this is what the critic Brian Holmes has described as the flexible personality, which is required by our sort of capitalist moment of neoliberalism. So the danger is that curators' efforts provide the socially reproductive lubrication that maintains capitalist relations, inadvertently justifying and neutralizing government cutbacks and perpetuating the status quo. Meanwhile, many arts workers struggle to derive their livelihoods from the sector. And so I've got the start of a conversation that took place between myself and two colleagues for a discussion that's going to be published later this year. And Jenny is Jeannine Richards, who's part of a group called Manual Labours, who's been working with Nottingham Contemporary on a project where they're thinking about this building and its kind of psychosocial impacts on people who work here as well as come here as members of the public. And Jenny has talked about this sort of fiction of the coping curator who always looks immaculate, who's got a very neat haircut, lipstick, not coincidentally a sort of feminized figure, who offers the clean house or gallery and the welcoming smile, and always kind of suppressing the actual conditions under which she's working. So in this conversation between Jenny, myself and Daniel Child, we started by saying, well, if one of the problems is that we identify a bit too much with our work and, as it were, do anything at personal cost to make the show go smoothly and not admit our fragilities and vulnerabilities, what might it be to disidentify? And so, as it says here, we started by kind of pooling some of the ways in which we over-identify with our work in the cultural sector. So here are some of them. Presenting the clean gallery and the welcoming smile, so mystifying the labour within cultural work, not distinguishing between work and life, constantly checking emails, whether at home or during social events, as if I'm constantly on the brink of missing something really important. the academicization of how we valorize the work we're doing, so that and visitor figures feel like the only forms of value the art world clings on to, and then what about the space for collectivity, democratic conversation, working 70% over what you get paid for, and so on. And so we sort of pooled them without individually listing whose particular foibles were noted. But I think this it's almost like a practice of consciousness raising, because I think in order to bring to the surface some of the bad habits that we've got into, where we really do sacrifice our own well-being and that of our sort of collective well-being in order to put the show on the road. So here are just a few more examples. Sorry, let me get to my next page. And so this has led me to, I'm in the process of developing a curatorial project which will happen later this year. And I was invited to take part, here's another one. They could really go on, and I'm sure you recognize some of your own fault lines of sort of what we do value and what we inadvertently devalue in the process of trying to sort of professionalize or trying to keep up with our sort of professional sides. So I've been invited to take part in a project called Take Care, which is initiated by the Blackwood Gallery, which is part of the University of Toronto. And they're running a 5-month research project, which looks at a whole range of sort of caring activities. And I think, here we go, we've got the 5, what do they call them? Circuits, 5 exhibition circuits. The labour of curation, which is the one that I was invited to do. My exhibition has become a bit more than just curation, but that is part of it. And then there's a focus on care work, infrastructures and aesthetics of mutual aid, stewardship and collective welfare. And I'd say that one of the motivations for this Take Care project is, in a way, to make the kind of the backside of an art organisation, and obviously in this case an art organisation located within a university, do a better job at reflecting the public front. So I think this is quite a common situation that we might observe, and it's probably something somewhere like Nottingham Contemporary falls into the stereotype of the radicality of what's on show, the radicality of the content, the radicality of the artistic propositions, the radicality of the public programs. But actually, are we taking on board those radical propositions in the way that we treat ourselves and each other and the collective strategies that are going on out of sight? So here is just a little bit more on these various circuits, and I would say that it's very much interwoven with activism. It's not just about presentation. There are going to be a lot of collaborations with different groups, be it people working in the hospice movement, migrant workers, sex workers, and so on. So I think importantly it's kind of using the space of the university and the exhibition to forge alliances, make new knowledges available, and so on. So it's not just about representation. And here are just a few images from the publication, which literally went up on their website yesterday. I just managed to grab a few images for my presentation. It's downloadable, so I haven't even had a chance to read it myself yet, but this is going to be one of a series of publications and micro-publications that will accompany this focus. So sorry to be going on a bit, but I've only got 4 more minutes. So just to... Okay, so the exhibition I'm doing is called Habits of Care. And so I'm trying to look at where do we habitually put our caring labour, particularly in the cultural sectors, and where does care tend to be neglected? So as a kind of demonstration of where care is paid, this lovely work by Amy Siegel, where we see the cleaning of the artifacts and also the couch at Freud's house, at the Freud Museum. So here we have the idea of, literal care and cleaning and dusting. Also the idea of the care of the legacy of a great man and his intellectual trajectory, but also perhaps the care of the psyche, and sort of thinking about that. This is a work which references Audre Lorde, of course a very important voice in thinking about the politics of self-care as itself being a political act, but done within the context of collectivities. This is from a work by an artist called Raju Rage, who will be contributing. Now, I'd asked Raju to do one of their bathroom occupations where they occupy institutional space to draw attention to the lack of institutional care meted out to certain bodies, and particularly bodies which, let's say, fall between the genders and therefore kind of are not cared for. And interestingly, Raju has said, yes, they'd like to take part, but they found these performances that they had been doing really exhausting. So instead of doing something very theatrical, they actually want to make an audio work. So I had to slightly suppress my disappointment as the curator, because these performances are really fabulous. But actually, on an ethical level, I think there's also something really important about the artist saying, no, I'm not going to make this kind of work. I'm going to make work that allows me to sustain myself and my own energies. This is a work dealing with, it kind of works as a sort of guided meditation, and it relates to, it's almost like a kind of diaristic account of the artist's holiday in Italy, where she became observant of the sea and the fact that there were no fish anymore, and what gets washed up are these kind of melted plastics, and a sort of contemplation on the sea as a kind of hyper-object, and thinking about care in that context. And this is one way, this was from a previous version, how it might be presented. This will be done as a billboard, tears, from a $10 bill. And this is by the same artist, Claire Fontaine, which is a kind of anti-self-help video. It is drawn from a self-help video, which espouses the philosophy that you can cut anybody out of your life if you consider them to be toxic, like a cancer. You could do that to your partner, you could do that to your co-workers, you could even do that to your own children. So it's this kind of vile notion of individualism and a kind of fiction of autonomy where you just cut. So you're this kind of completely free-floating liberal subject. And just very finally, I want to mention that there will be a workshop around curating and care. So I'm inviting people involved in this field to spend a couple of days developing new propositions for care within the art world and the curatorial sector. And part of what we'll do is look at some work that's been done in the past to kind of develop certain policies and protocols around payment, around universal design, other sort of ethical issues. This is from the wage, artist fee structure, universal design. Anyway, here are just a few examples, and we will try to generate some new propositions coming out of our own experiences and some of the challenges and paradoxes we face.
Thank you very much.
I guess it's...
okay for you? Is that set up? Okay. Let's see. It's not, It's a PDF, so I'm not sure you'll be able to do it as a slideshow. Yeah, you can. Where is it? Fantastic. So, okay. What's on? This is not free software, so I cannot do it now, dear. Maybe say okay. Okay. Maybe say okay. Yes, okay. No, it doesn't. Don't worry. Just breathe, move a bit, move the body. If it's not working, I can even talk without it. Where is that? Okay. Normally PDF is working every place, so. Let's see if this can. Let's see what Microsoft is doing with the content. Whatever. No, because I put it in PDF because it's working on any platform. No, it's okay. I mean, it's. Don't worry at all. I'm not.
Do you have the adapter?
Ah, that's another.
Yeah, maybe not.
It's okay. So I do it like this. Let's do it like this. It's fine with me. Maybe later I will show you some images, but then you have now to believe me on my words. There is no proof of what I'm going to say. Oh. Ah, shit. That was a good one. Okay. So, but I'm on my feet now, so I won't stay, because this is really a problem for me. When I was preparing the talk, I was thinking of 3 moments, because I will be 50 in 2 weeks. And every lecture I'm giving, I'm saying it, because I have to get used to it. So in every lecture, I'm saying. So there is 3 moments in my life I can share with you about feminist methodology. One is I've been working and collaborating with a non-profit organization based in Brussels called Constant, and it was dealing with art, new media, feminism, free software, and open source. Because in some of, in French, for example, what is running on this is called systèmes d'exploitation, exploitating system. And so as a free software user, because I'm no programmer or free license user, I want to be able to question my système d'exploitation. So it's not like that I will be making propaganda for the free software, even if I'm doing it. But it's more to say we should be able to ask questions. We should be able to open the tools. No one has to tell us you can't do it, or you can't open the tools that you're using for your work or for your as a citizen to have access to the data and so on and so forth. So this is one of the things that I will show you. this moment on in art media, free license, free software, and so on and so forth. The second, I was director of museum, the Fundación Antoni Tàpies in Barcelona. So I will have a moment on this. And the third one is now I'm director of an art school. So this is the third moment. But then I said, you took these 3 moments, but not the moment before all of this. And just because feminism for me was not unpainful. Because when I made my coming out, it was also that I began to deconstruct all my past somehow. How I was educated to be the person I was to be, or I will be, or I was, or I am. So because I was educated to fit in, because the social past I have, this was, you have to be a teacher, or you have to be a mother, because you were good at school, so you can be a teacher, no? In your village and stay there. And so art for me was, as I said, a way to escape the class and to escape the body almost. But then when I became a feminist, it was always discovering that I built myself against my mother, for example, who died this year. And so the transforming, I mean, the feminism, as I'm using Françoise Collin and Irene Kaufer, they're Belgian feminists. So some of you must not understand, but what's mostly important is this idea of displacement. So that was a good one for me to move towards you. But to say always, never take anything for granted, never take anything by nature. So you have really to question continuously what's happening. We were talking today about to be tired of questioning all the time and working all the time on your conditions of work. So the fact that all the time you have built, I mean, the feminism is really amazing. It's an empowering tool, but you don't sleep well ever after that. Because always questioning your position. Of course, as a Belgian, and also we took that in the school at one point, we're coming from a colonial country. So we addressed white as a color and a position that we are. If we became a welfare state, and Webb Du Bois mentioned it, that socialism was based on the exploitation of other people. I mean, Belgium was becoming a welfare state, and it's still, in fact, it's getting down because of Congo. I mean, you can be generous exploiting from somewhere else. Some people can exploit and use oil or other resources, but Belgium was built from this. So this is something that you assume to be white women, working class, and because also we're working on trans in the school, straight, and so on and so forth. So all the time you deconstruct your position and where you're talking from. I thought I will share this with you because we didn't use the time to define feminism. Feminism as a practice is an individual and always collective practice. Are you okay? Yes. I move, my dear. It is this thing we will call he or it. It didn't like Virginia Woolf. It just swallowed it. But Virginia Woolf is the one that, it's talking about the spider web. So the condition of the women, how the women live and create. Let's see with the next one. Surprise. Yes. So within Constant, I mean, of course I will repeat, and it's normal that what Anne and Helena said, because if there were no coincidence, no resonance between us, that will be said that feminism is also questioning intersectionality, but it's the conditions, the economic condition of work. How is it produced? I mean, how do we work? And so we did a project within Constant that was called Cuisine Interne Keuken. In Belgium we have 3 languages, so it's a mix between English, French, and Dutch. So it was internal kitchen, because we were wondering how can we survive in this non-profit art world. Because we were in Belgium, you can open a space, it was cheap, you can afford to rent, it's not like London. I mean, you can eat and breathe and be on unemployment money. I mean, it was okay. But then there was a moment of tiredness, and also how can you sustain? Because I was mentioning to someone when I was working in Constant, I worked 10 years, but I was paid 2 years to be on that job. Because someone said, what was the best working conditions for you? I say, when I built my working conditions, so I was exploiting myself completely all the time. Because I had a double life. Daytime I was working for other organizations, and nighttime I was working on this project. So suddenly we said, but wait a moment, how does the other people work or survive? So we begin to be dressed, and we use the kitchen thing. So because we were using the care, labor, and the cooking, and we're asking people around, like this kind of event, we do it in different festivals and so. Okay, how much are you paid? How many people are you taking care of? How is your studio? Can you do your working space? Because we didn't know how much you ask for lecture. As you say, you accept the job before even know how it will be paid. How can you survive if you have to take care of your parents, of kids? Where are you living? What is your working room? Some people were during the working space with the bed. Because of the computers, it was fair enough. You can work in any place, but that means you cannot reclaim a place for work, because you can work home, which is nice. But then, how do you differentiate work from life if you can work any place? And now with a smartphone, I was telling Rosie, it's amazing how it changed in the last 5 years. People are working even when I'm talking fine, but we cannot disconnect. And if you do, you feel guilty because you can work. And you're not answering your email, meanwhile you have a feminist lecture? Bad girls. So that was one of the projects that we collect knowledge, because we realized also some of our friends, and it's fair enough, could go on deeper in the art sector because they have parents who can pay the rent of the flat or the inherit. It's fair enough. I don't mean to be saying it's bad or good, but to know how you can deal with that. So this is one of the projects. So let's pass this, but the machine was not an enemy, but a possibility. So that was something that really we embraced. That, and so this is the moment cyberfeminist was active in the end of the 20th century, if you remember. But it was also interesting because in the 2000 and something, floods of money was coming for Europe to bring diversity, as they say, or women into technology. What for? To have cheaper work labor, to have cheaper, workers? Workforce, yes, to have cheaper workforce. So there was really bringing women into technology and also giving money to PhDs and projects to research on gender and technology. And so we realized that the PhDs and because I was working also in a training center for women into technology, so the unemployed people who was to train to find a job were also going to be a server administrator, or to be to work in call centers. So you have all this working force going to technology, researchers and artists. So we brought all of these people together, at least to me, because for me, cyberfeminism was not, or the Cyber Manifesto was not like a title on. I did believe it was true. I did believe that it should be practiced. So we organized different events, bringing together artists, workers, and academics who are working with computers. Because someone working a cash machine is working with a computer. Or so someone working in an office is working with a computer. How they can work together. So we did build our server, a feminist server, because we thought that it can be like a woman's house. It was called, so we were trying that the knowledge on the technology should be shared, because you can be as feminist as you want, but there is someone taking care of the machine, say, no, you cannot install this. or who is taking care of the server, who is taking care of the computer. Maybe it's different here. The computer part. It's generally someone who is like overworked, tired, burnt out, but he or she cannot share the work, the knowledge. So we were training ourselves to be able to run the server. At the same time, we were organizing babysitting, exchange of cooking recipes and so on and so forth. It's really a lot of energy because we discussed also who has free time to do free work, to do free software, to take care of this. So it was really difficult to tune time and energy to work together. But it's still running, this co-learning technology, but it's also really hardcore. Most of the people at other works and being elsewhere. So this I will pass. This is where I was, Helena, in the box there. So this is with Terry Tamlis. This is another example of the work is the radio, and I don't know if you know Terry Tamlis, who is a transgender electronic musician, American, based in Tokyo, and so we did some work together, a CD, and to make fun of me. But it was really all the work we did, 2 works that we did to question the authorship, deconstruct gender, discuss who is taking the word and so on and so forth. And also that's a way of being in an exhibition. We open a radio space when we invite people to talk, but that's another practice. Shit. I will send you the PDF and you can distribute it because I wanted to talk about hospitality because this was something that was important in the Fondation Trinita Pièce is, as you said, a clean house and welcoming. And so to take on the hostess part, but also to study the radical hospitality. That radical hospitality, so it's like radical hospitality is to give the key of the house. So to give away the mastery of the house. But then the moment you give away the mastery of the house, you are not the master anymore. So it's this paradox of being the master, giving the keys and disappearing. So of course, when I was director of the museum, I was the master of the house. I can say this light is off, this light is on. It's a small institution because of some institution you cannot control the communication, the lights, the guards, and so on and so forth. Here we can work all together. So the idea of giving away the keys of the house, this is something that we worked. And the fact that like the clean house, the smiles, all what you said, but to really explore it, explaining, when you invite someone at your place, you explain how the coffee machine is working, how the toilet is working, the garbage. So we pushed this somehow to say it's a public, it was a private institution with public money and public mission to really explore the possibility of welcoming. 5 minutes, forget about it. So this is Alan Capro exhibition. This was React Feminism. And that was our attempt of this, that in React Feminism, inside the exhibition space, because I don't know if you know React Feminism, but you could, it's a video library, it's a project by Beatrice Stammer and Bettina Knaut. It was on reenactment and reinventing of feminist performance all around the world, but this was a video library. And so I didn't want, but this is another, that because with performance, sometimes the documents of the performance is becoming the object of exhibition. No way. It's a document, like you've seen Capro, and this was React Feminism. So all the DVDs, you can only look them as a video library. But we wanted to group to have access to this, and these DVDs could not get out of the museum, so we bring the people in. So that means that any group could come and use the next door space to screen and discuss video, but also we test that we put table, chairs, video, internet, and they do whatever they want. And so the program was updated by the people themselves. So that was the idea. One of the ideas was the hospitality experience, but that was based also on the generosity and flexibility of the director, the worker, the guards. I mean, we were all part of the welcoming and giving the key. So it was not giving the key and manage. We were there to assure that everything going okay, but I was not controlling anything, nothing. So it could be bad art. It doesn't kill anyone. You cannot tell this. It's a bad exhibition. It's okay. So that was yes. One. So I did one also because there is a say that, okay, if it's feminist practice, you have post-its and kitchens and tables and mess. You can also have proper exhibition. No, this is one. The last one I did with Maria Lasnik. That's the last painting before she died. So now to the school. What did I put for the school? Yeah, this is, if you don't know this book from Bell Hooks, I mean, to be in the school is something that you can, going from as also, I would say, from an even drive working situation to a sustainable practice of resistance and exploring strategy, actions, and so forth. I'm sorry, it's all mixed up by this thing. So it's really this, how can we transform some of the desire of change, of challenging the institution into an institution itself, which might be sad, but let's try to really, from the repetition of some gestures, that it will be said that this is normal. This is normal that it's a collective practice. This is normal that the transparency of the institution. This is normal of the welcoming and the hospitality. This is not something that is added or resisting to the institution, but this is how the institution works. So the school and the public institution allows to, we have put on a plate to try out this. So I wanted to finish, so this is, yeah. That was about vampire. It's beautiful, huh? No? Because, as I said, because to be able to give away power, you have to have the power. So this paradox is, because I can be so cool and say, okay, I gave the key of the house. Well, of course, because I have the keys. We change the institution because I run the institution. So the fact that I'm inside, and this is a movie on Blood and Wings that if you look at it, it's only from vampire footage with the voice of Tony Conrad, and it's about vampire and capitalism. So it says some of us has to be contaminated, but they are in danger and they are the danger. So solidarity is about taking care and being in control of them, but some of us has to be contaminated. And you have also beautiful Octavia Butler on her last book on vampires to die for. And so also this is also when I'm depressed, I'm thinking, okay, but you're a vampire, you're a monster, go girl, it can be okay. So this idea that, of course, the paradox of you can give away the power if you have it. You can be, I mean, the generosity of the privileged one somehow. So this is important not to forget. So that was this is the radio that was running 36 hours because the student asked for that. We stay open 36 hours, but the radio will be installed somewhere. But just to finish, the danger of this is because we had the danger of this is of this collective practice because we had there is a group of teachers, students from the school, from other school, gathering to question genders and races in art, in pedagogy, in art schools, because as we said, that art schools are really highly place of subjectivity. And so some of the teachers realized they have only male reference and only white male reference. Also the bodies that were supposed to be or to act was not the body that's, questioning the body of the teachers, the body of the students, and also sexual harassment in the art schools. So we had some meeting and some students were coming from the Netherlands. And one of the students said, okay, that's nice, but I'm coming from Brazil. And at one point we were cleaning the school, we were looking for money to pay the janitor, and you know what? We wanted to do our art. Now they are in the Netherlands, and they have collective practice in the room, in the classroom, but they don't know anything about the janitor. They don't know anything how the economy of the school is working. But so to be, as a feminist, you don't sleep, as I say, to be like careful about, okay, collective practice, collaboration, but what does it mean? Because we are putting in place in the school that we run with the students the budget, we're talking about the care, about the cleaning, about the rubbish. I mean, if you have been in an art school, you know that a lot of art is coming with you're coming from England, maybe it's not the case, but in Belgium it's coming from the garbage. I mean, you recycle the wood, you recycle the paper, anything you find to make your work is, and this, for the moment I have 2 mountains of garbage inside the school. And so, but how you deal with collaboration, and collaboration is an interesting word, no? Because it can be to work with the enemy, or to work in collaboration, like in collective. So how do we, the fact that we want to embark this collective practice, but then is it at the price of the individual practice? So how does it go, and what are the limits? Voilà. Sorry for the mess.
Formulated question yet, so do excuse me. I thought that was incredible. It was really encouraging to hear all of you, actually, and I related to quite a lot of what you were saying in a sort of cringeworthy but very truthful and honest way. I don't know what to say I am, actually, now, because I kind of feel strange calling myself an independent curator. I'm a gallery director, and I'm very independent as well. I run a small, I'm not even sure whether it's a commercial gallery because it's failing miserably. But I'm enjoying making work with artists and meeting other curators. But the question, I suppose, that's ruminating in my mind, and particularly in response to the last speaker and also what Helen was saying about hospitality and this idea of caring, is I want to ask what a curator should look like now. When I did a curating MA 15 years ago, there were lots of stereotypes kind of buzzing around, and there was a book that had just come out called The Men in Black, discussing what a curator physically should look like, and a sort of stereotype, really. And what we see now as well, that's in inverted commas, obviously. What we see now is a lot of people talking about a particular type of person doing courses like that and going into institutions, and lots of women doing postgraduate studies in curating, but that not necessarily being reflected in the workplace. And the stereotype of women working in galleries, particularly in the commercial sector, is that of the gallerina. So what does it, and by that I mean someone in a role where they're seen as perhaps what they look like and what they say to people. So I'm just interested in where you feel women fit into the workforce now as curators and what that might look like in the future. Very selfishly, really, for myself, and I suppose lots of other people want to know that too.
I think we could all. I'm sure Anne's got stuff to say on that as well.
Yeah.
I would say yes. Most of the people who come into curatorial courses are women. A lot of the ones who end up getting hired as curators and directors are men. Something funny can happen when the sort of feminized traits that I was talking about get taken on by a man, and they somehow then have this gloss of glamour because, oh my goodness, he's a caring man. And it then becomes something kind of exceptional and really prized when it's just a woman, it's business as usual. I would also say that quite a few of the people who come through the program that I teach on end up not even sure that they want to be curators, perhaps even in the way that they projected into before they started, and they want to kind of melt away more and work with other people. And that in itself can be certainly, I would say, a curatorial way of working, but they become much less interested in authorship and much more interested in, well, there's this space called a gallery or this space called art, and how can we use that, and what are the possibilities of, bringing people together in these spaces which, have problems but can also a certain amount of license and a certain amount of openness in terms of what happens within them. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
no, it's all interesting. No, it wasn't really a question, was it? I apologise for that.
Do you want to say something?
I just want to say how deeply sexist I find that word gallerina. I know you were saying, but I think I just find it so incredibly offensive, and I think that it's another way of masking or aestheticizing labour and the position of women in the art world, and it's just like, it's reductive and it's awful. And there was a really nice article about exactly that word actually a few years ago that I remember reading in an art magazine. Maybe if somebody else can remember it, it's a really good article.
And I would say that one of the creepy things about the gallerina concept is that a number of women identify with it, and so they turn themselves into objects, and it becomes this kind of vicious circle because they're, a number of them probably do have MAs, PhDs, they're highly, highly educated, but they then start to internalize the idea that they are there to be an object, to be a brand associated with, the beautiful work in the gallery, and this is like really dangerous.
Hello. I just wanted to say that, I hope that the kind of character of the curator is becoming more eclectic and less easy to define as a man in black. And certainly, I think the trend continues that most curatorial programs, MA programs, in the US are populated by women. I think in my class at Bard, I went to the Center for Curatorial Studies. There were 13 of us in my class and 2 were men, so that gives you a sense of the imbalance, although that was years ago now. But I think that we need to really look at and study what's happening in institutions, because my impression is that while a lot of junior curatorial positions are held by women, as you start to move up into chief curator positions, more and more men are in those roles. And certainly then when you move up to the director, more men are in those roles too. So I think it has to do with who's getting promoted, who has a skill set for personal career advancement and negotiation. And then I also think it's really important that we look at pedagogy and what's happening within the pedagogical systems to prepare people. And also a really big issue in the US is that there aren't enough curators who are people of color. So beyond the gender question, there has certainly been a real failure to bring people of color into the curatorial field, particularly when it's in institutions. And so I think we have to really look to academia and the programs and make sure that they're getting more people of color into those programs so that they can move into the museum field. And there's a lot of conversation about this in the US right now. Not enough, I think, progress, but that's the other issue that I think, is at play here that's really important.
I would just say from the course I teach on, we hardly get any. We get quite a lot of applicants from Asia, from China and Korea and Taiwan, but we hardly get any black British or other black people even applying. Right. So it's not even that they come and then, for whatever reason don't get hired. I think a lot of them just don't even, for whatever reason, recognize this as an environment that will be nurturing to them.
Right.
Take other paths.
Where I come from, I didn't know curators were existing. It's just when I began to, even when I was an art student. No, I didn't know. So how can you imagine people coming from different social classes to know that there is a job definition of curator? This is it's really, when you come closer to that world, you know. But from outside, there is no projection possible, I think.
Hi, I've got a bit of a snarky question, I think. What happens as a feminist curator when you come across a white middle-class man who's making work that's quite formalist, but you're interested in it? And I just wonder about how you frame it within your kind of actively feminist, progressive, or can you see what I'm trying to say? Like, how do you reset that asymmetry that we've experienced through our education and through our careers? Yeah.
I could say a few words. Well, I think being feminist doesn't mean you have to cut off certain aspects of yourself that are of interest to you. So if you like formal abstraction, enjoy yourself. I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. I think that often formal abstraction, depending on the context in which it was made, can be interpreted too much from a formal language, and that the social context and the impulses behind the work sometimes get overshadowed over time, and that would be an interesting thing to look at. But I also think for me, I've been thinking a lot about, because I love materials, I love material work, I am very interested in formal questions, and obviously the intersection of formal approaches with conceptual ideas and context, social, political, personal context, and how all of those collapse into an object. But I love objects. I really just want to be around them all the time. But I also am thinking in the political moment that we're in, particularly in the US, with the election of Trump, that there are certain kinds of practices and ways of being artists in the world that I'm just simply more drawn to right now because they feel more urgent. So, whereas perhaps I would have done an abstract painting show 5 years ago, probably not actually, but let's say I did, that wouldn't be an exhibition that I would be drawn to do right now. So I think always thinking about what seems to resonate for yourself, for your own practice, but also what are the urgencies of the moment, and what artists, I feel that artists who are addressing those in some sense need support in that moment to help us, kind of muddle our way through some of these really complex issues that are always visible and they're a part of society, of course, but they kind of rear themselves up in certain moments and need to be, I think, addressed and looked at.
Also, I had experience of, because now when we invite a lecturer, or when I was in the museum, an artist, I'm asking him, he or she is nice, and respecting the workers, because I have also lived that feminist theoretician treated like shit, people they think so it doesn't, what you define doesn't mean that the person is not active. Maybe you're thinking of a dead artist, but if he's alive, for me, I was really taking care of the fact how this person behaved, because because I experienced this when I was in Constant, and we were a group of artists, and so when there was an event, we were acting as the curator, acting as the cook, but there were photographers, filmmakers, but the filmmaker was also the technician, like Craig and Paul. But really, I can give name afterwards. Really misbehaving with the people who were serving the food. And you say, so it doesn't make. How you define doesn't make how you act. So this is for me.
Yes? Okay. Here I am, Laurent. This is a question for you. I was interested in knowing a bit more about the open software and operating system. You talked about the server, but I'm more thinking about how being tied up mainly to operating systems, provided by Apple and Microsoft, how that is limiting on one way, and how kind of catering or lobbying for an open source operating system is a political choice. I was a Linux user before I joined this institution, and now I'm using Windows, and I have basically a notice every time I open my computer telling me that I have a pirate version of the original Windows, and it's really annoying. So I would like you to develop a bit more about the political choice that it is.
But you can answer this if you were using Linux before.
But I want to hear from you. Sitting on the because the coincidence of beginning with Constant, it was so in the 90s when the computers were getting cheaper, but I always had second hand, but that's another story. And so also I was a Macintosh user because it was for dummies, no? You could use it without knowing anything about how it works somehow. But then in 2000, we began interesting in, we were all working with computers, like being in film, music, graphic design. So it was part of our working environment somehow. But it was the moment of Napster. Do you know Napster? And so really this idea, and also the fact that computers were used more and more by artists, there was this question about author rights and copyright. So the fact that artists who were using found footage and making a critique of the representation of gay, black women, but re-editing the media, and those people were forbid by this same industry to do that at the same time that the Napster issue. So we were really interested in this, the copyleft. So we did an event where cyberfeminism and copyleft were together, because to be an author is not by nature. Women, it took time to get
the legal vote to have a work. So to be an author is something you can be or not. You can. So sorry to do this, but the questioning of the authorship came with the technology, and how can I? Yeah, it's really taking a lot. But it was really to have access to your tools, because all the Adobe suite is creating a certain aesthetics. So it's like the aesthetics or the tools, it's like a prosthesis to your body that you don't question, or it can't be accountable to you. And so the fact that working with free software, we could talk to the people who were developing the software. So part of the work of Constant was to bring together the users and the designers of the tools they were using. So willing to break that bridge in between the tools of the artists were using and the people that were creating the tools. So that, and so for me, it's really access, as you know, free software is based on the freedoms to open, to study, to modify, and to distribute the modification. And what you can't do at all with all the software that you use. To have the possibility to open your operating system and understand how it works, because now it's in the pocket. I mean, with the smartphones, we have to begin all over again. That's the problem. But to have access to these tools, it was, I don't know, it was obvious. I can't even say, you ask me why it's political that it's open? It's really to have access to how the data, I mean, we see with this thing I won't mention, this so-called social network. I never say the name publicly. This is hell. I mean, this guy developing it in free software, by the way, because this is interesting with free software. You can't even prohibit your enemy to use it. Meanwhile, in the Macintosh, and when you say agree, they can prohibit the use. But if you use free software and free license, you cannot prohibit. You can use your author moral rights, but how it works is determined. I mean, also you have all heard of this ransom attack. It's a crack in Windows, and Windows is not falling apart. People are not throwing the computer by the windows. They keep that shit inside, that it's completely open. Meanwhile, the open and free open source, when you have a crack, there is a community of people taking care and repairing. And you can ask for help. This is why I abandoned Macintosh in 2000 and went to Debian. It's the fact that I was tired of asking my friend to send me the pirate version or whatever. Now I can say update, upgrade, and everything is taken care. But this is a model for me for the institutions. That to have an open source institution for public institution, that you should have access to how it works. And you can transform it and modify and copy the modification. So I know it's a bit vague for the people who are not inside, but it's really this transparency, accountability, and this possibility of interact with the machines that really are part of our day-to-day environment. But it's impossible to. I was always the only one inside the institution, except for the software is like the text or the image, but to change the computers of the people, that's really difficult.
Crumbs. Right. Back in 1990-something, I have a dual nationality in Canada. I went off to the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia on Erasmus Socrates placement. And I did two things. I did advanced studio work with the Canadian editor of Third Text, who happened to be there, Michael Fernandez. I don't know if you know the name. But I was also doing curating at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. In fact, I was the shadow for the curator, and I did all of that on my own money. I guess all I got was a place, if you know about the setup in Nova Scotia, Anna of Anna and the King and I, by the way, no less, founded the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia and then went on to founded the local art college, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. And I can only bear testament to the fact of a person of colour. You could also find yourself in a situation where you're completely disempowered and you find yourself working like a slave as an assistant curator doing all the work. And all you get for it is an A on your report saying how good you worked, your job. And you're also 2,000 quid out of pocket. So it was a great experience, and I happened to be interested in the other, and I was looking at First Nations and black artists in Canada. I was working with Inuit as well, artists, and also Asian Canadian artists. So maybe I was kind of cherry-picked, seeing it where I was doing St. Martin's to fill that particular role without realizing it. So I just went there innocently to get some work experience, to give me an insight into what it was like to do curating, although I was actually an actual visual artist. So I hope to goodness things have improved a great deal since then. From what you tell me, not a lot, but I totally sympathize with the plight of women in this. There are other disempowered people as well, that's all. Thank you.
All what you show, because this is really amazing to disidentify with the work. Can we have access to that, or is something that you're going on to have this self-confession of the bad habits that we have?
That particular list is going to come out in an essay. In that, there's a trialogue between the three of us that will come out later this year. It's actually in third text in an issue on social reproduction, which is edited by Angela Dmitrakaki and Kirsten Lloyd. But I also think it's the sort of thing we need to be doing amongst ourselves, because I think once you kind of name it and then you can see it, it gives you a certain potential to understand what it is that you're doing in a kind of natural way, and then go, okay, there it is, and it's not just me, it's us, and now how do we try and move on from that? And so I've been trying to practice saying no to things that slightly, I would say, maybe like flatter me. Oh, isn't it nice to be asked to do it? And then you actually look at what it is, and you either go, well, no, I don't think that's really what I want to put my energy in, or I'm just doing too much and I'm just going to say no, even though it probably would be, potentially an interesting project, but there has to be, you have to protect the other parts of your life. I haven't yet. I think it's the sort of thing that's been coming up more and more in the group that I teach. And actually this question of care and self-care has come up in a few of the projects that they were working on for this year. One of them, one of our black students, who's from South Africa, has developed a whole project around public vulnerability. And she's organising these public crying sessions with a group of other black women, and they're going to start off doing it in Trafalgar Square. And I think they're looking at sort of traditions of public mourning and some other things that more to do with her own background in South Africa, but the sort of crying as a sort of political tool. And another student who's from the UK is working with artists with sort of different physical sort of challenges and disabilities, and that's she's kind of building a program which is very durational, so there's a lot of time, there's a lot of a very kind of spread out schedule. Her background is in performance, and she's used to kind of festival formats, so she's really kind of challenged her own kind of very fast, intense way of working, and really thinking about the pressures that puts on herself and other performers. So now she's come up with this approach to curating, which is much more slow and really sort of says, well, what are the needs of the people I'm working with, starting with the artists.
Thank you. I wonder if it would be all right for me to pick up on that and to link back to something you said, Anne, very early on in the evening about intersectionality and how, for you, a feminist approach is, by definition, marked by intersectionality as well. And to pick up that idea about disabled people and the contribution of disabled people and disabled women in particular. And I looked at your list, Helena, and I thought it was really interesting because for me, for a lot of other disabled people, that kind of self-care, it's non-negotiable. It just has to happen. And I think that without lapsing into stereotype, a lot of disabled people can actually pass on a lot of wisdom around that kind of self-care. I mean, no is a word that I have to say a lot. Will you come and no, I can't because it's up a staircase. So no, it's not going to happen. And if I'm going to resist having that put upon me as my problem and me being the problem, then it becomes about self-care and it becomes a challenge. And Laurence, you talked about you never sleep as a feminist because you're constantly, well, you never sleep as a disabled person because you're constantly recognising that you're the big bad wolf all the time. And I just think there's something really, I'm blethering, but there's something really interesting going on about the invisibility of disabled people in so many of these discussions, and yet the absolute central role that deaf and disabled people could be playing in these, and are playing in some circumstances. I do get that, but could be playing so much more of a role in these conversations. And I guess I'm interested, and to know how in the Bureau of Feminism, where disabled people are, deaf and disabled people are located. Sorry, I was very long-winded. I apologise.
Very succinct.
I'm so glad you brought up this question because I think it's really important. And in the conversations around diversity that we're having at the museum, certainly disabled people are part of the long list of people who would fall under various forms of diversity. But I'll just talk about a couple of recent experiences I've had. I just worked with an artist who has a disability, I suppose. She doesn't call it that, but she has health issues that mean that she has to really create limits for herself in terms of her energy level, her physical capacities. So when you're thinking about installing and spending the day, standing around on a cement floor, this is not really an option for her. And it was just very interesting to work with someone who had these ways in which she had to create limits in order to stay healthy. And I did see it as a kind of a model for me. And it even allowed me to, decide that we were going to spend more time installing her show with shorter days so that it wasn't this like, well, you have 3 days and if we don't have this done, then, you're in trouble kind of atmosphere. Thinking about, somebody who actually needed a business class plane ticket, not because she's a spoiled brat, but because it was really going to be difficult for her to fly from Berlin to LA and have any ability to even, work. We had her come 2 days early, so she had a couple of days to acclimate and be able to go to the ocean and walk on the beach and not have to arrive from a long flight and get up the next morning and work. So it was really, I appreciate what you said because she made me really think about these issues and realize, I should go take a walk on the beach and go in the ocean before I have to work all next week too, which I don't do enough. And then the other example I'll give you is I recently did a performance with a partially deaf artist, and I'm probably going to invite her to do something else. And I've really enjoyed our conversations because she's very high functioning, but those conversations have been more aesthetic, I suppose, in the sense that what she's really interested in is how her experience of the world through her deafness means that she's highly attuned to other things and is really fascinated by that kind of disconnect that she has, let's say, in social situations where she can follow some of what's being said. I mean, she reads lips. She actually started to lose her hearing as a child, so you can't hear it in the way she speaks, in other words, because she learned to speak without it, without losing any hearing. So often people don't realize she's deaf, and what happens is she's in situations where she actually can only absorb maybe 60% of what's happening, but she's really interested in how she can enact that same kind of dislocation that she doesn't find to be a disability, but rather a new way, a different way of experiencing the world. And how can she replicate that in the kinds of work that she's making? She's primarily a filmmaker, so she works a lot with this kind of unusual relationship between image and sound. And she uses subtitles in a very unorthodox way. She often works with music, interestingly, and composers, and she sometimes works with deaf composers. And when she shoots films, she hires as many deaf people as she can on her crew, and she also likes to work with all-female crews. So I'm just really interested in her practice and the ways that it's informed by her deafness, but also the kind of way that she's created her own practice to, to have a kind of ethos that she wants for herself, if that makes sense.
I really thought the way you phrased that question was very eloquent. Thank you. And what I think you were drawing attention to is that some of these issues that we've been talking, or maybe that I was in particular, but Laurence as well, about the idea of interconnectedness and that we're not these autonomous beings. It strikes me that a lot of disabled people don't need that to be spelled out to them, or that doesn't need to be theorized. That's something that is part of your everyday, and actually that's something that a lot of us could learn from, because we are all co-related, but we don't always behave as if we are. We don't always appreciate the many ways in which other people are involved in our well-being, and maybe vice versa.
I have one last question for the panel, which is, we've been talking all day now brilliantly about the ways in which discriminatory systems like capitalism, patriarchy, racism shape our work in curating and art and academia, in our case. What would you three of you say, what are the possibilities that the art world offers us to resist or contest or oppose those structures that maybe people working in social care or banking or other parts of the work world don't have access to? What resources do we have that we can mobilize in our field? If any.
This is a good question, because I was asking myself this every day when I was in and also today sometimes say, but why are we staying there, and why art and not just abandoning? But for me, it's it's a place that still you can create some environments. So there was at one point in another conversation about alternative pedagogy, we were talking about tableau vivant. So the fact that you act as if, so to create an environment, aesthetics, a place as if, or if, so to create a laboratory of experimenting behaviors, relationships, possibility, bodies, if you have a safe place, obviously. So for me, when I was thinking of abandoning the institution, I said, no, people need a place when it's warm, there is electricity, you can welcome them, and we can experience together a form of science fiction possible. That's but this kind of what if, as if possibility of laboratory, and also it's a place, that you can bring different disciplines together. This is not so many places when there is time for this and possibility, but the condition is it's a safe place.
I love that. What as if. I do think that. I think something can still happen through the sort of affective impact of non-representational expression when we're not just being told what to do or what to think, I think, and that can have a contagious effect amongst bodies that come together. Certainly from my own experience, things have happened in the realm of art that have opened me up to other perspectives in a way that, let's say, more social science writing or whatever doesn't. And I just think these spaces, somebody earlier, Alba, was talking about using the kind of cracks that institutions open up, and I think within those cracks we can come together and have kind of encounters and conversations and listen to each other in ways that perhaps we don't otherwise. So it's really how we use those cracks rather than there's anything inherently valuable in art or art organisations, but they are potential cracks to make use of.
It's just sort of building on what you both said. I really do believe that museums are one of the most accessible public spaces that we have still available to us, and so many spaces have been privatized. I mean, museums, as Helena was talking about earlier, there are moments of risk there, but I think they still really can be and are fundamentally a public space. And we actually sometimes refer to our museum as a community center, which I think is kind of funny because it sounds so, I don't know, like a old term that you wouldn't apply to a museum, but I like embracing that notion because, of course, community is so important. But I also think, so as Helena was saying, it can be a space where people come together to have dialogue or explore ideas. But I also think that what's optimistic about the museum and art as a space where social change actually can be enacted is really simply that it's a space where the imagination of what the world could be can manifest and can be very active. And I don't think there are so many spaces in our life where that kind of imagination is nurtured. And that's, what as curators we try to do over and over again. And that can take many forms. And I think it's important that the multiplicity of forms is also about a multiplicity of ideas that then can kind of generate and be examined by the public in that particular space. So I'm very optimistic about museums, and I think more than ever, being very clear about what our motivations are for our institutions is really important. and not being afraid to actually take up, controversial, difficult political subjects, because I actually think it's one of the spaces where that can happen in a meaningful way and should happen there.
Thank you very much. I think I'm going to draw this to a close now. I'd like to thank the three speakers for their very fascinating presentations and engaged answers to your questions. And I'd really like to thank the audience for coming and for your contributions to our discussion, and for the staff and the building of Nottingham Contemporary for hosting us here this evening. So thank you all very much.
Sorry, just one second. Thank you. I just want to say thank you. I have a million questions, but I didn't want to kind of take any space. Well, it's just very important for me personally, but I think also for the institution to have you here and have heard this conversation. Basically, I think hopefully will bring good things. And I just wanted to briefly say that next week we've got the last event of this series, and we are screening in the evening a really, truly amazing documentary following the steps of an incredible woman who is now the mayor of Barcelona in Spain, and she was activist for the anti-evictions movement in Spain for many years, and now she's the mayor of the city. And the film is really, really wonderful, and I hope you can come because it's totally worth it. It's at 6:30 next Thursday, happening here, and we also have speakers coming from Spain, Italy, Greece, and Croatia. So it's going to be quite a good gathering as well for the last event. And yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you again for accepting the invitation.